The Nixon campaign of 1968 responded to the protests for racial justice that were taking place at the time by calling for law and order. Does that sound familiar? And the policies that developed in this new era were even more insidious. When Nixon became president, he declared drug abuse public enemy number one. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman revealed that the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks and hippies who opposed the war in Vietnam. Quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This strategy of using racially coded language and the implementation of supposed race-neutral policies designed to specifically appeal to white voters who wanted to maintain their privileged status in society would later be perfected by Ronald "Mommy" Reagan, who ushered in a new ideology which would serve to maintain the racial caste system: neoliberalism. This obsession with austerity, which, sorry to tell all of you JC39 stans, actually started to gain traction under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, ultimately resulted in policies that decimated the social safety net and essentially cemented the racial inequality that had been created as a result of slavery and Jim Crow laws. And since the investments that would be necessary to address racial inequality were in effect forbidden, it prevented meaningful progress from being made. These policies were justified by the ideology of neoliberalism. If you're poor, it's your fault. Government is the problem. Assistance to address poverty just creates a culture of dependency. Let the markets figure it out. These bootstrapist ideas were sold to the public through fear-mongering about crime and crack babies in order to expand the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and the racializing of government safety net programs like the myth of welfare queens, and the strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps was used to rationalize the cuts to our social safety net. These messages were used as a way to convince a large percentage of white people that the general concept of government assistance is synonymous with giving black people an unfair and undeserved advantage over them. And it was insidiously deployed as a political weapon to obscure the fact that their primary goal was to vastly increase the advantages of corporations and the rich and powerful. Of course, it was all a big con job. America's a big con job. That's history. The very construction of race, and by extension racism, in America, developed as a way to justify free labor, also known as slavery, to increase the profits of the ruling class. So the tactic of tricking a bunch of white people to believe that their advantage in society was under threat in order to perpetuate a system that was created to benefit the wealthy worked yet again. And after 20 out of 24 years of Republican power, the Democrats of this era relented. Something they love to do. They cried uncle and found a third way to win elections again, by triangulating progressive policies and Reagan-era austerity, coupled with catering to the interests of the rich. Essentially, the white flag was raised, and the new paradigm and default setting of American politics became the basic ideas of neoliberalism and tough-on-crime policies. In the same way that our country operated under a system of Jim Crow laws that enforced a racial hierarchy for 90-plus years following Reconstruction, our country has operated under a systemically racist, neoliberal mass incarceration template for the past 50 years as a response to the victories of the civil rights movement. This also happens to be the same era that a certain Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has operated under. In fact, he has been one of the major contributors to many of the problems we are facing right now. Which brings us back to what is happening today, where the movement for Black Lives is calling for an end to the war on drugs, the over-policing of their neighborhoods, and mass incarceration. There is a call for reimagining public safety, which would include massive investments in affordable housing, healthcare, and education that would effectively end the current neoliberal paradigm. The system that has maintained the racial caste system in America is being challenged in a way that it hasn't since the 1960s. But as predicted, there is a backlash. And this time, the threat is not Jim Crow segregation or neoliberalism and mass incarceration. It's, no graphic. Okay, well, it's fascism. Fascism is the thing.
Fascism is a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of supposed threats by leftist radicals, minorities, and immigrants. He promises only he can save us.
This is philosopher Jason Stanley, author of the book How Fascism Works. Stanley argues that there are 10 pillars of fascism. And while it is worthwhile to note that Trumpism happens to check the boxes of all 10 of Stanley's pillars of fascism, and that Trump apologists have made arguments like, well, it's not like we have concentration camps or ethnic cleansing or secret police pulling people off the street, despite the fact that predictably all those things are now happening, we are going to focus on just a couple of Stanley's pillars of fascism for the moment. Because if you are still not convinced that Trump is a fascist, or at the very least represents American fascism to a T, feel free to check out the other videos we've done on this topic. But to recap, here's a short summary from our last episode. Fascism goes through phases from ideology to full-fledged regime, is characterized by palingenetic ultranationalism, anti-globalism, a rejection of feminism and socialism and homosexuality and Marxism and cultural Marxism, an obsession with conspiracy theories, a fear of the other, a creation of in-groups and out-groups to be rejected from the in-group, an obsession with heroism and violence and machismo and weaponry, a collection of syncretistic intellectuals complaining about liberal academia and commies, a death cult led by a charismatic male leader in the form of an ideologically inconsistent and unprincipled opportunist who plays on emotions and fears and popular trends to further a dictatorship against the left amidst popular enthusiasm due to a crisis of capitalism and ineffective liberal governance and political gridlock via uneasy alliance with conservative elites creating images, traditions, and language unique to each country and leader and people. That's the basics. Handsome guy, get some sleep. And so, in retrospect, clearly there are a lot of reasons why our nation is primed for the rise of fascism in 2016, which include the white majority's fears of losing their privileged status to rapidly shifting demographic changes occurring in our country. And it's worth noting that the increased size and scope of the Black Lives Matter movement right now is as much a response to the rise of fascism as the fascist backlash is a response to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. A feedback loop. A snake eating its own other snake. No more analogies, I'm sorry. I think it is important that we take a moment to examine why fascism is the logical response to this moment in American history. Because the terrible truth is, America will do everything it can to maintain capitalism and its racial caste system.